Picture this. While sitting in a courthouse, a family just heard that their offender was sentenced to life in prison for the death of their children after fighting and demanding for them to receive the death penalty. As morbid as it may sound, put yourself in their shoes. How would that make you feel to know that the person who murdered your loved ones, although in solitary confinement, will be fed, allowed to socialize, and be allowed to spend recreational time outside for the rest of their lives? Hi, my name is Michaela Crawford, and today I will be arguing why the death penalty needs to be supported and implemented in all states across the US. I will first begin by providing examples on why I hold this belief and why I believe abolishing it will be a problem. Although crime has been on a decline for the last few years, the murder rates in 2020 have been extremely higher than past years. For this reason, I believe the death penalty needs to remain intact in order to deter people from thinking they can commit a crime without execution being a consequence. Professor of law Margaret Redden stated in 1980 that revenge is a private practice between one person or group and another, and may or may not be justified. Retribution, on the other hand, is a public act, or more specifically, the formal act of a community against one of its members, and is carried out for reasons that are justified under political constitution. Retribution also allows for family members to come to peace with the offender's crime. Scott Vollum, an assistant professor of justice studies, said, "In regard to closure, co-victims often express relief that their ordeal is finally over and they can finally move on, something they were unable to do as long as they were required to relive through the traumatizing events of the murder through the many appeals and hearings, as well as the media reports." Lastly, the death penalty should stay in place because it is justified in the Bible according to the story of Jonah. If you're not familiar with the story of Jonah, Jonah is commanded by God to preach to Nineveh, but takes the ship to the opposite direction. A storm soon approaches, and Jonah admits to the crew that he is the cause for the storm. He knows that he must be thrown into the water for the storm to stop. Although the crew was very loyal to Jonah and they were very reluctant to do so, they knew that throwing the sinner overboard was exactly what needed to be done to calm the tempest. This is known as expiation. In 2014, professor of political science Joseph Molesky explained how expiation is the clearest and earliest justification of the death penalty. He says, "Expiation is the belief that crime makes the criminal, in some spiritual sense, unfit to live in a society and renders the society as unclean." So, since the US strives on one nation under God, shouldn't the same principles in the Bible be applied throughout our country now? I provided you all with various reasons on why the death penalty should not be abolished. So instead, let's look at ways in which we can improve it. In 1985, a study was published by economist Stephen K. Lawson at the University of North Carolina that showed that every execution of a murderer deters on average 18 other murders. These numbers could be even higher if, instead of trying to abolish the penalty, we worked on ways that we could make it better. For starters, we need to keep offenders accountable for their crimes and apply the penalty fairly. If one person is sentenced to death row for the murder of 3 people, so should the next. Next, there needs to be a defined definition of who can receive the death penalty. If every state specifies the specific grounds for the death penalty, there will be less wiggle room for unjust sentencing. Lastly, there can be no mistakes. This is a matter of life and death, literally. Judges and juries need to be 100% accurate in criminalizing offenders and making sure that they have the right person when sentencing. This will prevent innocent people from fighting for their lives for crimes they did not commit. Now, let's visualize a world where the death penalty is abolished in the US. Let me start off by saying everything said here is all hypothetical. It is impossible to actually know what would happen because it is an unforeseen event in the US. To start off, hypothetically, crime in the US would skyrocket if the death penalty is abolished because criminals will no longer fear death as a consequence. Since death isn't a consequence, prisons will also soon become overflowed with inmates due to the natural increase in life imprisonment charges. In a way, this could be worse than the penalty based on how you view it. Professor of poli-sci Dr. Molesky in 2014 explained that the death penalty is the least cruel method of deterring murderers. Life imprisonment places the criminal in a living tomb long after the crime has faded from memory. A long life of imprisonment and arduous toll may be crueler than the short pang of rapid death. Just think about it. If prisons start to overflow, the conditions will be worse, and our corrupt systems will deteriorate even more than ever. Lastly, allowing criminals who commit terrorism, serial killings, serial rapings to live out the rest of their lives seems completely unfair to those who are in prison for much less crimes. So, what can we as Americans do to help better the death penalty throughout our country? We can sign petitions. By signing petitions and urging congressmen and our governments to clarify and improve the death penalty instead of trying to get rid of it, victims will no longer have to worry about their offenders getting shorter sentences. So what are you gonna do? Let the system continue to be corrupt, or take action and help the US by demanding clarification and support for the penalty? Thank you.
I was about to